All right. Check. All right. Good morning, everyone. Apologize for the late start. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers in the room. Before we get started, prayer request. See Brother Garrett's back. That's good. I know there's still others that are traveling or will be traveling soon. We want to remember Brother Larry in our prayers for his pituitary and the issues that are going on with it, and for his doctors and care team. Those who are grieving loved ones, those who are still recovering from surgeries and have surgeries that are upcoming. I think Brother David, he has a surgery that's coming up soon, skin graft, coming up early next week. You have another one? Yeah. On Tuesday? Okay, the 21st. Okay, so Tuesday, Brother David's surgery. So let's keep him in our prayers. Everyone who's dealing with cancer as well. Anyone else? Brother or Sister Sherry, Sister Bonnie. Okay. Okay, so I'll go ahead and lead us in prayer, and then we'll get started with today's lesson, finish up where we started off last time. Let's pray. Father, we want to thank you again for waking us up this morning, for blessing us with our health and our strength, and for putting us in a country where we can come and assemble together without having any type of fear of being persecuted or being having repercussions for coming to worship you and study your word and to learn more about you. Father, please be with those of our numbers who are battling with health issues. Those who are traveling, please help them to have safe trips and get where they're going and back home safely. Please be with those who are still fighting cancers, Sister Helen, Brother David, Brother Stan. Please be with Brother Larry and his team of doctors as they try to determine the best course of action. I pray that whatever is decided upon will be successful. Please be with those who are continuing to recover from surgeries that they've had. Sister Debbie's back, Sister Letha, Craig Goley, Brother David, and anyone else that I've missed that has had surgeries and are still recovering. Please be with those who are grieving. Please be with those who are hurting in various ways, those who are hurting physically, those who are hurting financially, those who are hurting emotionally, spiritually. You know all of our problems, Father, and I pray that you'll deliver to each one of us exactly what we need. Thank you for your Son, Father, who you did deliver to us, that we all need, who came and died for us for the forgiveness of our sins. And I pray that as we study today, that this information will be beneficial to everyone who's here to hear it, and anyone who watches it online, and that we will be able to retain this and be able to teach it to others. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so fast fossils is what we've been learning about. We'll do a quick recap of what we learned last week and what we went over as far as last week goes. So there are some different types of fossils. There are several different fossil types, but the most common one is called the permineralization fossils. But you have permineralization. You also have natural cast fossils, like the one that's shown here. There's trace fossils, which will be footprints and things like that, tracks. Amber preserved fossils, and then other fossils that are preserved due to volcanic ash and ice. And as I mentioned, permineralization, that one is the most common type, and what's required for that one is that the organism has to be buried and quickly, and there has to be continuous sedimentation in order for these fossils to form. And then there also has to be water that's involved with it, and that water is going to carry minerals. And what those minerals do is those minerals will replace the organic material that's in, let's say, the bone or whatever is being fossilized. So the bone is made up of organic material. The water will carry minerals, and those minerals and the sediment as well, and then those minerals will infiltrate the bones and eventually replace the organic material with minerals. And so that is how permineralized fossils are formed, which is the most common type. And then we spent some time, we watched a little video about kind of what we will be taught in biology class as far as how fossils form. But the common theme is that it takes millions of years, and they talked about different kind of types of fossils, trace fossils and the permineralized ones that are formed from water and sediment. And then we talked about two different views on fossils, two takes on fossils. So there's an evolutionist view that holds to an old Earth, so that the Earth is billions of years old, and then the animals died, and then their bones will be covered with sediment over time. And then fossils are going to form over millions of years, and then that the rocks that the fossils are in are also millions of years old, or hundreds of millions of years old, depending on the rock, or even billions of years old, depending on the rock. But that is the evolutionist view, taking old Earth into consideration. That's how the evolutionists, that's the take on fossils. Okay, so there are some expectations. If this is true, then there are some expectations that you would expect. First, you would expect to find evidence that the fossils form slowly and by gradual processes, because that's kind of the take on it. It takes millions of years for fossils to form. And then you'd also expect to find evidence that the Earth is very old, because if it takes millions of years for fossils to form, then the Earth has to be multiple millions of years old, or as they would say, 2.5 billion years old, or 4.5 billion years old, as far as the age of the Earth. There are some new handouts that are coming out for today's lesson. Also, we had one for last week as well, so if you missed last week, you may need that handout as well, which is what I'm going over right now. Okay, so the second take on fossils is this. So as biblical creationists, and we went over definitions recently, and what that means is that we believe the Bible's account of creation, so that God spoke everything that there is in existence, and he did it over a 6-day time period. And so we believe that the Earth is thousands of years old, not billions of years old, so we believe in a young Earth, and that most of the fossils were going to be formed by a global flood catastrophe in Noah's day. And that during that, there would have been massive amounts of sediment that would have been moved on the oceans and also on the land as the flood water rose. And then that the animals that were buried would have been quickly covered, and then the rock layers were also laid down quickly. And so we don't believe that the fossils would have taken millions of years to form, because the Earth itself isn't millions of years old. And this is the reason why we believe what we believe. We went back to the Bible, which is our basis for everything. So in Genesis 7, verses 13 and 14, and then 17 through 19, it talks about the flood. And I'll read that again. It says, on that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and their wives and their 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Skip down to 17. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. And so this flood event is going to be crucial and critical as far as understanding the evidence that we see. Last time we also talked about evidence in previous classes, and I asked the question, is there more evidence for creation or more evidence for evolution? And the answer is the evidence is the same. It just depends on your viewpoint, your worldview, on whether you see it as being evidence of creation or evidence of evolution. But the actual facts are the same. So the evolutionists and the creationists have the same facts. It then just determines, it goes down to which explanation best explains the evidence that we've seen. So if there was a global flood, and that was responsible for the formation of the fossils as we believe, then there are some evidences that we would expect to find as well. So first thing is, we should be able to find evidence, we would expect to find evidence that fossilized animals were quickly and catastrophically buried. So very quickly buried, not slowly over millions of years like what we hear in our science classes, but that the animals were quickly buried in a catastrophe. Secondly, you expect to see evidence that fossils form very quickly. And so again, not over millions of years, the organisms not laying on the ocean floor, slowly being covered by sediment over millions of years before it forms, but we would expect to find evidence that the fossils form quickly. And then the third evidence that you would expect, if this is true, is that there would be evidence of a lot of death by drowning, lots of death by drowning, because if there was a global flood, then obviously numerous organisms would have died. Okay, so continuing on with what we learned about last week, we talked about kind of the science explanation, which you'll see in your biology textbooks, as far as how organisms form fossils. Okay, so this picture is this comes from a textbook, and it says an ancient crocodile dies in a river. So why it's known that water is going to be necessary along with sediment for forming fossils. Then it says, number 2 over here, it says the sediment covers the body. Number 3, over millions of years, the sediment becomes rock and the crocodile becomes a fossil, and then eventually the rock erodes, exposing the fossil, and so it's been millions of years later, due to erosion and earthquakes or whatever it is, the fossil is then exposed, and then we dig the fossil out. And then here's another explanation. So as far as marine fossils like fish, which 95% of the fossils that are found are marine, which would make sense if global floods started in the oceans. But what you'll see is it'll say that a fish dies and sinks to the bottom of the lake, and then the fish rots and the bones are left, and then the fish is covered in mud. And then over long periods of time, there's more and more and more mud and sediment that covers the fish, and then it eventually becomes fossilized over long periods of time. So the fish bones are laying on the ocean floor. And then last time we also talked about problems with these explanations. First off, for anybody who's ever had a fish tank, or if you've gone fishing or had fish in a minnow bucket, we know that when fish die, they don't sink, they float. Okay, so majority of the time a dead fish is going to float because there's gases that build up as its internal organs start to decay, and it reduces its density, so the fish floats whenever it dies. And then you have your scavengers that are going to eat the carcass of the fish, and then whatever does make it down to the bottom of the lake, bottom of the ocean, there's going to be bottom feeders, and then lots of bacteria and other things like that that'll efficiently do away with whatever is left of the fish. And so there wouldn't be long periods of time for the fish skeleton or fish bones or whatever to be slowly covered by sediment and then change into fossils over millions of years. And so we watched a quick video, we're going to watch that again about that, but this video was about a whale carcass that was floating and was causing some problems, and it was very hard to sink. They had to set explosives off to try and get the carcass to sink. Okay, so I think this is where we left off last time, I believe, or close to it. Okay, so again, there were those three evidences that we talked about as far as global flood expectations. And so we're going to go over this first one first, which is evidence that fossilized animals were quickly and catastrophically buried. So not slowly over long periods of time where they covered with sediment and formed fossils, but they were buried quickly and catastrophically. Okay, so here's the first example. Here is a fossil of a fish, and actually it's a fossil of two fish, because you can see that in this picture, a fish is actually in the process of eating another fish when it gets fossilized. Okay, so we know that if we watch TV or if you go on fishing, that this is something that happens very quickly. A fish swallows another fish very quickly. It's not going to take a long time for that to happen. And the fish is not going to, lay down on the bottom of the ocean floor while it slowly enjoys its snack and wait to get covered with sediment so that it can become a fossil. So it's obvious when you look at this that this was something that this fish was quickly covered with sediment, and it was done in a matter of seconds while the fish was in the process of feeding and eating another fish. And it happened so fast that the fish is still stuck in its mouth. It didn't even have time to completely swallow that fish. And so that tells us, when we look at this, that this happened very, very quickly. So there had to be a massive amount of sediment that was moved in order to quickly cover a fish and fossilize it that quickly while it was still in the process of eating the food that it was eating. Here's another example. This organism, this is a marine reptile. It's called an ichthyosaur. So if you're a dinosaur fan, or if you like those ancient creatures like that, this one may be familiar to you. This one is not considered a dinosaur. It's considered a marine reptile because dinosaurs are technically land creatures. But this is called an ichthyosaur. And what was found is this fossil right here of this ichthyosaur. Okay, all right, so what you see in here is this creature is actually in the process of giving birth. There is a baby ichthyosaur right there that's coming out of the birth canal as this ichthyosaur was fossilized, as it was covered and fossilized. Okay, so we know that animals, marine animals, any animal, is not just going to lay around on the ocean floor for millions of years to slowly get covered with sediment as it's giving birth to its offspring. So in order for this to be fossilized in the process of actually giving birth with the baby ichthyosaur coming out of the birth canal, it had to be quickly covered. It had to be quickly covered in a matter of seconds with enough sediment for it to not be able to move and to be fossilized. Because if there was just a little bit of sediment coming on it, then the thing would just swim away. It wouldn't lay there for millions of years in order for a sediment to come and cover it while it's giving birth. Okay, so again, this is something that would be consistent with what you would expect with the global flood. So the global flood would have started in the oceans. The Bible talks about the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep. And so that would have been lots of volcanic earthquakes, seismic activity, and volcanic activity that was associated with that, which would have moved massive amounts of sediment. Massive amounts of sediment would have been moved during this event. And so again, we see these examples of things that are instantly, this has to happen instantaneously, that they're covered with enough sediment that they're not able to move or finish the process of what they were doing. Okay, continuing on that. So here's another one. So we've all seen fish schooling on TV before. If you watch the nature shows and stuff, and you see the fish and they school and then they just kind of flow, and it looks like there's hundreds of fish, but they all kind of move in tandem with each other. It's kind of like one organism when these fish are schooling. All right, so here's a picture of a fish, a school of fish, and then what we see is we have a fossilized school of fish. School of fish that is fossilized as they're schooling. They're still in formation. that they would normally be in. This is the same pattern that schooling fish would naturally be in. However, the entire school of fish is completely fossilized in their schooling pattern. All right, the only explanation for this, the only way that this could possibly happen is if, again, massive amounts of sediment came down and quickly covered these fish into this as they were still in this schooling pattern. It doesn't fit the story of fish fossils forming from a fish that's laying down on the ocean floor and being covered with sediment over long periods of time. And so we see again from this set of fossils right here that it had to be something that was quickly and catastrophically that occurred in order for these fossils to be fossilized the way that they are. Okay, so that brings us to a couple of questions that we need to consider. The first question is, what evidence is there that fish lay on the ocean floor and are slowly covered and fossilized over millions of years? What evidence is there that fossils take millions of years to form? That's an open question. Is there any evidence that it takes millions of years for fossils to form? No, it isn't. So there's no evidence that it takes millions of years for fossils to form. As I mentioned before, most of the time, though, fossils are not going to tell a story as far as how long it took for them to form or not. Most of the time, it's just a fossil. And so you have that evidence, and then you make a story, which is historical science. You come up with a story that you think best fits that story, or fits the evidence that you see. And a lot of fossils, majority of the fossils, you can't tell one way or the other if it formed quickly or if it formed slowly. But there is no evidence that it takes millions of years for fossils to form. However, there are fossils that have been found that do show that fossils had to be, that some of them, at least some of them, had to be quickly covered, and that there had to be massive amounts of sediment that was moved in order for that to happen. Okay, so that second question is, what evidence is there that fossilized fish were quickly covered and that they formed quickly, short periods of time? We just went over a couple of those. And so, again, it always goes back to the evidence. The evolutionists will have the same fossils. So the ichthyosaur, the fish that's eating its food, the school of fish that was fossilized while they were schooling, everyone has the same evidence. That's the same facts. It goes back to which explanation better explains those. Yeah, go ahead, Reggie. Right. 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 So I was just listening to a podcast on this exact question. There's a couple of theories or explanations for it. One of them, so the question is, why don't we see the human fossils when humans were on the earth at the time of the flood? The best explanation is what they call a needle in the haystack theory. So at that time, I think they believe that the earth was probably 1,500 years old. And so the estimates that they have is that there was probably about 10 million humans on the planet at the time. That's an estimate. Nobody knows for sure. But population of probably about 10 million or so. And then when you think about the flood and the amount of rock that's been laid down due to the flood, the probability is very low of finding a fossilized human. So I think what was said, it was that if it were 10 million people around at the time of the flood, then that would average like one person being buried in about 70 square kilometers of rock. So 1 human body and 70 square kilometers of rock, which is like find a needle in a haystack to actually find a human fossil in that amount of earth. Fossils themselves are rare, even though there's a lot of them. Fossilization is a rare event just due to the conditions that are required for it as well, which we'll talk about more as well. But that is the best explanation. Some people will say that, you know, humans are obviously more intelligent than animals, and so when the waters start rising, then people seek higher elevation and things like that. And so maybe the humans that later on in the flood, or the majority of the humans died in the latter parts of the flood, and so not as many would be fossilized as easily as the animals and things like that. Which there could be some validity to that, kind of on a limited scale, because not everyone would have had access, you know, to mountains and things like that, and the flood would have taken several weeks to occur. But the needle in the haystack is the best explanation that I've heard to this point as far as why you don't really find human fossils in the fossil record. Okay, that answer your question, Bro Gene? That'll have to do it for now. Yep. And I can research that more and try to find some more information. Yeah. A marine. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So vertebrate fossils are rare to begin with. Yeah. So only 5% are land animals. I mean, not vertebrates, but land animals. So yeah, that's a good point. 95% of them were things that were already in the water to begin with. So also a good point. Okay. All right. So that was kind of the explanation for marine animals and how they form fossils, and also evidence that fossils are going to be formed quickly for marine environments. But then that leaves a question: what about land animals, which we just got through talking about? We know that there's not many fossils of land animals, but land animals do fossilize. And so this is what you will get from a textbook as far as the process of forming fossils from land animals. And so this picture says so here's a stegosaurus. He dies, or he falls into a river, because everyone knows that there's water that's going to be necessary, and also the movement of sediment. Okay, so the organism dies in locations such as a riverbed, where sediment can rapidly cover its body. And then over time, pressure and additional sediment compresses the body, and the minerals replace the hard structures such as the bone. And then so that's going to take millions of years, and then the earthquake or an erosion exposes the fossils after millions of years, and then the paleontologists dig up the fossils. And so the process is pretty much the same explanation, except that there's water that has to be involved. So let's say that the organism falls into a river or it dies, and then the river is going to bring in sediment that's going to cover it, and then over time it's so much sediment that it compresses, and then the same process. So the fossil forms in the same way. So it's essentially the same explanation, because everyone knows that fossils require water as far as the permineralized fossils. Okay, so let's see if what evidence we can find that supports this, or if we can find evidence that land animals are also quickly and catastrophically covered, and their fossils are going to be formed that way. Okay, so here's a picture of 2 dinosaurs that were in the process of fighting. These dinosaurs, here's what they are called. There's a Nanotyrannus, which it's a tyrannosaur in the tyrannosaur family, but it's a smaller one, not like a T-Rex. So this one is only about 20 feet long, about half the size of a T-Rex, but it's smaller. And it was fighting or trying to eat a triceratops. And so this is what the actual fossil looks like. This picture, previous picture right here, kind of helps you to see it a little better. But these two animals were fighting, and they were in the process of fighting each other when they became fossilized. Okay, so again, most of the explanations would be, the animals were fighting and then maybe they fell into a river and so on. And then you go back to the rest of the story as far as the water and the sediment covering them up. But I'm pretty sure that if there's two animals that are fighting and they fall in the river, I don't think they're going to keep fighting when they're drowning in the river. They're probably going to try and swim and get out. And so this fossil right here is good evidence that these animals were quickly covered as they were in the process of fighting. So they're fighting each other, and then a massive amount of sediment covered these animals while they were fighting. So this is Nanotyrannus and a Triceratops. This isn't the only fossil of fighting dinosaurs that have been found, though, while they're actually in the process of fighting. So here's one with a Velociraptor, which is, for those of you who like dinosaurs and watch Jurassic Park, it's kind of been made famous due to Jurassic Park. And this one is fighting a Protoceratops. So this is Protoceratops is in the ceratopsian family. It's kind of like a Triceratops, but it doesn't have the horns, the three horns like Triceratops does. But you can see that it's in the process, it's getting the better of this Velociraptor. It's got its foot in its mouth. And then all of a sudden, these two are fighting, and then they're quickly covered with sediment, and so they're fossilized as they're actually fighting. Okay, dinosaurs fossilized as they're actually fighting, which is great evidence that these animals were quickly and catastrophically buried, and not falling in a riverbed and then slowly being covered with sediment over long periods of time. Here's another fossil right here. These are two turtles that are fossilized as they were mating, and there was like 9 pairs of fossil turtles that were found in the same area, all doing the same thing. They're all mating, and then they were fossilized in the process of doing that. And so that was obviously something that happened very quickly. In order for this to happen, for dinosaurs to be fossilized as they're fighting, for turtles to be fossilized as they're mating. And so the question that arises from this when we look at these is, do these fossils, do they support the evolutionary explanation for fossil formation? Okay, so again, we all have the same evidence. We have the same fossils. It just goes back to which explanation is the better as far as explaining what we see in the fossil record. So I'll open this question up for everyone else. Do these fossils, do they support the evolutionary explanation as far as how fossils form? Or do they not? And then explain why. It's got to answer for it. Yeah. Okay. Right. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, good point. So in order for any fossil to form, that means something has to die. And as Brother Larry just said, every creature has a built-in, survival instinct. And so you're not going to sit there and keep fighting if you know that you're dying. You're going to try to save yourself. And all these fossils, dinosaurs dying while they're fighting, ichthyosaurs being covered while it's giving birth, turtles while they're mating. It just shows that all of these things, they're happening instantly. They're instantly being covered and they're instantly dying, and not having the ability to get out and to save themselves, which means that the amount of sediment that must be covering them must be immense, that they're unable to get out or to move or to even get out of the position that they were in. It had to happen quickly, and it had to be some type of catastrophe that causes that to occur. Okay, so that was it for that lesson, for lesson 4. Moving on to the next one, which is the Medusa effect. Okay, so going back to our global flood expectations, the first one that we've been talking about is evidence that fossilized animals were quickly and catastrophically buried, which we've seen. There are animals that are dying fighting, dying giving birth, dying eating their food. So that's the first part of it. The second thing that we said that we would expect to see is evidence from the fossils that these fossils not only are they going to be covered quickly, but they're also going to form very quickly. These fossils are also going to form very quickly. Okay, so if we go back to Darwin, what he said when he was writing his book and making his predictions in his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin said that no organism wholly soft can be preserved. No soft organisms can be preserved. So that would be like jellyfish, squid, worms. None of these soft organisms can be preserved because he thought that fossils took millions of years to form, and so it had to be something that had bone or shell or some type of structure like that in order for that for it to be fossilized, because he believed in slow and gradual processes, and that only animals with hard parts would be able to be fossilized. And so here is a fossil right here that we see of jellyfish. So this is a Cnidarian jellyfish, and ironically, this jellyfish, they're still around today, and this fossil of this jellyfish, and I'm not sure how old that one is claimed to be, but I'm sure it's somewhere in the order of 100 million years or so, or older. But the fossil looks exactly like the jellyfish looks today, after supposed hundreds of millions of years of time that the jellyfish should have been evolving. But it still looks the same as the fish today, as the jellyfish today. But the key part of this is that jellyfish, we know, don't have any type of hard structure. If you leave a jellyfish out on the beach for a couple of hours, then there's nothing left of it, because they're made mostly of water. And so this kind of flies in the face of the evolutionary explanation of how fossils are formed, and that no soft body organisms can be fossilized, because we know that jellyfish don't have bones, and yet they're fossilized as well. And it's not just one, there's hundreds of these. There's hundreds of them that were found just in one quarry in Wisconsin. So all these jellyfish are found there. And I was reading an article, one of the guys who discovered these jellyfish, he said that this would have been in the, I think, 70s or 80s, but he was at a conference, and he gave his findings to the people at the conference, and he said that he was ridiculed for saying that he had found jellyfish fossils, because of the prevailing thought that nothing that was soft could be fossilized, because everything is fossils occur over millions and millions of years, and so that would have been an impossibility. Okay, so yes. Right. Mhm. Right. Right. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and that happens a lot. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, Point that was made is that there could be fossilized humans. We know that there are fossilized humans, but that due to the narrative and the prevailing thought that fossilized human or fossils that are found may be discounted because of the thought that is the prevailing scientific thought, which does happen a lot as far as we'll get to more of that as we continue studying this. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good point as well. So that the point that was mentioned was that the fossils, that this happening quickly shows the mercy of God that the animals didn't have to suffer um, because because of the death that was occurring quickly for a lot of these. Okay. um, so fossilized jellyfish, and as we were saying, that the guy who first presented this information was ridiculed because it didn't go with the thought of the time. Was that our second bell? Yeah, it looks like it. Okay. I think that was our second bell. All right, we'll pick up here next time on Wednesday. We'll continue with lesson 5 on the Medusa effect. All right.